Thank you for joining us for another edition of Sree's special election coverage featuring the latest news, analysis, and special guests. It's Election Day, noon Eastern Time, 10:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Sree Srinivasan is our host. Mary C. Curtis is our political analyst. Mitra Kalita, CEO and co-founder of URL Media, is our guest. This is part of a series of shows Digimentors is producing in partnership with Scroll and Scroll Global, one of India's most important independent. We have another show at 9 p.m. Eastern tonight, which will be Wednesday morning, 7:30 a.m. in India. We are also producing the Indian Express U.S. election show at 11 p.m. Eastern Time, 9:30 a.m. in India on Wednesday. Cliff Albright from Black Voters Matter was our first guest. Brandon Jones from SPLC Action Fund was the guest on our last show. These shows are produced by Digimentors, the social digital events AI consulting firm Sree started with his friend several years ago, Andrew Lee. Again, Mitra Kalita is the CEO and co-founder of URL Media. You can follow her on Twitter at Mitra Kalita. Mary C. Curtis is a CQ roll call columnist and host of the Equal Time podcast. You can follow her on Twitter, mcurtisnc3. And of course, our host is Sree Srinivasan, a New York City-based journalist and CEO of Digimentors. Now, let's welcome Sree Srinivasan.
Hello, everyone. It's Election Day. It is also the moment of truth, as this cover of The Atlantic magazine by Tom Nichols says. It's the day where we have been waiting and watching for 4+ years, and especially in these last 100 days or so with the re-energized Democratic campaign of Kamala Harris. It's going to be a close election, and we're going to learn so much in the next few hours. We will not necessarily have a live election call, meaning knowing who is president, but we will have trends by the time we're on the air for our evening shows at 9 p.m. Eastern Time and at 11 p.m. Eastern Time. We are very grateful to you for being with us. Please tag a friend, tell them that they can watch us live or later. You're going to get analysis, you're going to get understanding of the issues, and we're going to take your questions. So unlike television shows where people are just screaming at each other, we're going to learn, and we're going to take your questions and show your comments on the screen. So that's part of the fun of what we do here. Here's Jonathan Borstein is watching. Greetings from New York, where early voting counted for about 20% of registered voters, according to The Gothamist. And here is Kaveri watching from Ireland and says, is the world going to sink or swim? And yes, what happens here in the United States has a disproportionate impact on the rest of the world. And Professor Kathy Joshi says, I voted in Wayne, New Jersey, no lines and no problems. I also voted today, and I was so happy to be able to vote right here in New York City. And this is this is the photo. This is the tweet I posted at Sree. And you can see there, I said that in 2020, 81 million people voted for Joe Biden, 74 million voted for Donald Trump, and 64 million people stayed home. Just think about that number. 64 million people stayed home in an election decided by a few hundred votes in just 7 swing states. So what we're going to do now is let me bring on Mary Curtis, our political analyst, and then we'll bring on our friend Mitra Kalita, who will help us understand what's going on in these last few hours before the election. Mary C. Curtis is CQ Roll Call columnist and Equal Time podcast host. Hi, Mary.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm here from the very swing and tense state of North Carolina. I voted this morning, my husband and I, early in Charlotte, no line. We were there about 6:45. And of course, with its 16 electoral votes and the many, many visits by the candidates and their surrogates, people will be looking at the returns here for an early sign of what the rest of the evening will bring. So let's go.
I know that you're ready. You've been studying the results as they're coming in, the early voting information that we have, trends, all of that. And then we're going to be live with you again at 7 p.m. Eastern and at 9 p.m. Eastern,
Yes, that's
and
right.
at 11 p.m. Eastern. But now let's bring on our friend Mitra Kalita, who is the CEO of URL Media and the publisher of Epicenter New York. Mitra, welcome to our show.
Hi, Sree. Thanks for having me. Hi, Mary. It's so
Hey,
good to see you again.
I know. We've been on a panel or two before together, so this is great.
I think during the Trump years, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm sorry?
I think during the Trump years, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, very much.
Well, welcome, Mitra. I know it's a super busy day for you. Tell us about URL Media and what you're looking at right now.
Sure. So URL Media stands for Uplift, Respect, and Love. We were found in 2021, days after the inauguration of Joe Biden as president. We were formed in the wake of the racial justice protests after the murder of George Floyd. I launched Epicenter NYC to help New Yorkers get through the pandemic and quickly realized with my CNN hat on, I spent most of my career in mainstream media, that being small on the internet is really, really hard. And yet being small and trusted in communities is really, really necessary. And so URL was born to band together small community media outlets around the country. We started with 8 BIPOC, Black and Brown media outlets. Today we have 36 partners. It's a mix of live streams such as this one. Scroll is one of our partners, proudly one of our original partners. Epicenter, Word, Native News Online. We have a Bangla live streaming channel, TBN 24, Black Voice News, Detroit Outlier. And I mentioned these, of course, I can't mention all of them, but we are in a large number of battleground states. And so the last, not just few months, but honestly, the last few years have in some ways led to this moment. And I can dive into more of what I mean, but you know, issues like housing and student loans and, you know, the border, deportation, legalization are issues that we cover day to day in service of our communities. And I would say when they surface in mainstream media as campaign issues, some of us are like, well, we've been covering this all along. So we could dive into what that looks like, but I'm really thrilled to be here. And I'm thrilled to share this perspective that I think is really close to the ground and yet still very important nationally and informs public policy as well.
You're so right. Maraj says, excellent show. Ellen is voted early on Saturday. Long lines at the Met Museum. She's talking about where people are voting. So folks, we want to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you voted or if you just have questions. We know people are watching from around the world. We did use a term that we want to explain because there'll be lots of things that are used in an American context that may not always make sense. The word BIPOC. Explain that, please, Mitra.
Sure. And I did shorthand that to say Black and Brown. BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. It's a term that's been around. I don't know the origins of it, but definitely after 2020 and the racial justice protests in the United States, but also globally, you know, took on this umbrella meaning to encompass people of color.
And one of the other things that we will be talking a lot about is the Electoral College. And so what we want to do is kind of just explain to folks what that means and how they can kind of try to understand what's going on with that. So we have here on our screen, we're going to put and show you this website, 270 to win. And that's the Electoral College, that the number that you need to become president of the United States. And you can see there are all these states. Not all of these are swing states, but you can see that there are different colors. And what the colors mean different things in different circumstances. And so what you're trying to understand is what states are already leaning blue or leaning red, and then deciding where they are in this. And so that's what we're looking at. You can see North Carolina on the lower right, NC 16. That's the 16 state votes that she was talking about, that Mary was talking about earlier. Mary, your thoughts when you look at this map?
Well, it's a very fluid race. There are several paths that they can each take. We always hear about those 3 states, the Pennsylvania, the Blue Wall, Wisconsin, Michigan, and all of those. Really, the polls are on a nice edge, a razor's edge there. But as I said earlier in the evening, you probably will start getting the results from North Carolina, and he really, Trump, pretty much needs those in any one of his paths to 270. And Harris would like to have it, particularly since there are questions about Pennsylvania and Michigan. So, that's what I see. We'll also be looking at Nevada. That'll be interesting. And as Mitra was talking about, so many of these states, the folks of color, the Hispanics, African Americans, Asian Americans, and others, I know in the Southwest, where I used to live in Arizona, Native Americans, they will really play a big role. And that's where there have been questions about access. Do they have access to the polls, say? And so we will see a lot of that going on as well. And right now, I'm also a little bit concerned about post-election. We've seen that in the internet, Donald Trump has already laid the groundwork, particularly with these close races, that there's fraud going on and that his followers should not accept some of these. He's saying he will declare victory very early in the night, where we know it's going to take maybe days, perhaps weeks, to count all the votes. And so, in states like Washington State, the Governor Jay Inslee has called this having the National Guard on hold in case people will be protesting and if there's going to be violence. And we see January 6th, of course, of 2021, that there was violence. So the fact that so many of these states were so close, but with the polls and the margin of error, we also know that maybe it won't be that close after all.
Yeah, we don't know how it's going to turn out. And here, by the way, we see Dawn is voting in Milwaukee. Thank you, Dawn, for doing this. As she says, thank you to us for doing this. We say thank you for voting. Jayanti says, excellent show. And Tara is watching. Big day. Good luck all. Diana is watching from on Facebook. Hello from California. We'll be voting soon, noon Pacific time, with my kids in tow. They can't vote yet, but I want to make it a big deal, especially this year. We are also looking at stories like on Telegram, a violent preview of what may unfold on election day and after. So Mitra, as you're hearing all of this, give us your thoughts on how to frame this and how to explain this to people.
So I think I look at the electoral map, and for folks who might say, oh gosh, that's a lot of red, right? Is the US really that firmly Trump country, might be the takeaway. One framework we've been using is to say that every state is a swing state. So what do I mean by that? While Mary is very right that the 3 states that both campaigns have really drilled down on are Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, there are races here in New York that could flip the House of Representatives, right? And so I think the framework for people of color sometimes feels like we're left out, right? If you're, for example, one of our partners is Pulso, and they're based in Miami, Florida. And a few years ago, as you all know, the Democrats basically gave up on Florida. Now that's changed over the last few weeks. Suddenly it mattered again. But if you're Latino in Florida, there's a feeling of being left behind, of being left out, of feeling like these national policies very much will affect you. And yet, if your voice feels like it doesn't matter in that map that we just looked at, then what is your place in this democratic process? And if there's a misstep, for example, during a Trump rally at Madison Square Garden, where somebody says something very damning about Latinos, and suddenly this community can be mobilized, the fact that we wrote off so many Latinos in states that once upon a time mattered and now they don't matter. And so I think one way that our network frames this is not from that nationalized lens, but really saying, what are the concerns of our people on the ground? How are we in service to our communities? And how do we make sure that no matter who wins, which I know, given kind of the composition of who might be watching and the anxiety that a lot of people are feeling, it's like, how can you even, be preparing for a second Trump presidency? But to Mary's point on security, that is a very real scenario for many of our people. And so I'll just wrap up with kind of how are we preparing our network. We support, like I mentioned, 36 Black and Brown community media outlets. We met with a security expert a few weeks ago. We've offered resources to keep your reporters safe. There's the internal kind of making sure that news and information is vetted. How do we know that we're not subject to outside influences, misinformation? I think many of our communities are the target of this in very orchestrated fashion. But also, how do we stay physically safe and making sure that our communities know it is okay to center your safety above all else, right? And I tell my own children this all the time, right? If you're caught on a subway, if something happens over the next few days, and a lot of New Yorkers are like, oh, this can't happen here. But I do think that our communities are operating from a pragmatic perspective of how do we keep our children safe? And I have to say, after 30 years in mainstream media, for me, as kind of anxiety inducing as a day like today is, it's also a privilege for me to work in media that cares about my children first, versus often feeling like mainstream media was, like kind of literally whitewashing this scenario.
So what we're looking at are MSNBC, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, and CNN, just to see what's happening. The first polls close in about 8 hours, and we will then know more about what's happening. It's noon here, so you'll actually have first polls close around 7 p.m. and then so in about 7 hours we'll have the first set of results. They'll give us a sense of what's happening, but will not tell us everything. The reason why Mitra's work is so important, among other things, is that mainstream media and just newspapers have shuttered across the country. More than 2,900 newspapers have shut in the U.S. in the last 20 years. More than 20,000 journalists, 25,000 journalists have lost their jobs. So Mitra, how do you make sure that you are filling in those gaps that are created by the economics of journalism? And how do you make sure you are still in business and all your partners are in business?
So our model rests, traditionally on advertising, but also non-traditionally on B2B services such as recruitment, consulting, government contracts where we are on the ground and telling people how to get flu shots and COVID boosters. And so any media model right now that is not diversified, I don't really think has a shot in this climate. And then the other reality, a show like this kind of underscores it, is that you have to be everywhere, whether it's streaming or social or a website or flyers or, doing appearances on shows like this to get the word out about networks like mine. And when people say, like, where are you? I say all of those places. So yesterday, Epicenter, I'll put my New York City hat on. We had a meeting just to talk about elections. We are going to leverage some of the national coverage from URL Media to fill that. We're in a waiting game. We don't know yet who the president is. There might be a result. And so the economics for small outlets to be able to tap into content services like those we offer is really invaluable. But also our editorial director said, I'm just going to do an Instagram video on housing because that's something we've covered so closely. A lot of national media now, like Ezra Klein and Nate Silver and Ben Castleman at the New York Times, have all kind of talked about housing and inflation over the last few days and how that's affecting the race. And she said, we've been covering this for years, so I'm just going to put some of this together. And she just quickly did an Instagram video summarizing our coverage, but also nodding to New Yorkers that are struggling to pay the rent and, might feel like some of this conversation, it's like, where have you guys been? And so just reminding people, we've been with you, we hear you. Our goal is to help you stay in your home. National media might cover you during evictions, but we're really with you. And I think, again, during moments like this for local media, it's such a reminder of the role that we play in your life all along up to elections, but also tomorrow and the days to come.
I really appreciate that Mitra is doing so much with these communities that feel unheard or unrepresented. You can sometimes think that, that the politicians really don't see you until election time. And one of these other communities, that's why I actually follow a lot the work of, and I was recently on a call with the Reverend William Barber, with people of low wealth and low income who care about the minimum wage and housing and so many of the other issues that Mitra was talking about, who feel that with the emphasis on the middle class, which is fine, that a lot of times you have a lot of people who are working very hard and they really feel like they can't get ahead. And they care about these issues of the minimum wage and housing and things like that. They said we never hear, even when some of the churches and religious communities have these rallies, it's more about power and not about poverty and the poor. So anytime you can shine a light on the issues that really affect people that don't feel reflected in the mainstream media, that's a good thing. And with all of these papers closing, a lot of journalists of color, and that wasn't exclusively their coverage area, of course, but I know so many people who have lost jobs or left jobs, and many of them are going to the other fields, either academia or nonprofits or other things like that. And these are important voices that really aren't getting out there, between things closing and also the questions about DEI and hiring. You see that so many of these voices and issues reflected in the media, they're just disappearing. And that's not good for democracy, and certainly not good for these communities who can actually end up being pretty apathetic, saying, what stake do I have in this democracy?
Folks, I'm Sree Srinivasan. That's Mary Curtis. That's Mitra Kalita. And we are having a very important conversation about the elections, about 6.5 hours before the first polls close. People are still voting. Your friends can go out and vote. 64 million people who could vote didn't vote last time. Tell your friends to go out and vote. Kaveri says yes to what Mitra said about for personal safety, pragmatism over lofty idealism. And Samipa is asking a question about ballot proposals. And there are several of them. They don't get the attention that we see for other issues. So Mitra, what are you telling people? I'm sure you don't even remember. There are like 6 of them on the ballot. You may remember some of them, but
yeah. So I just posted in the chat, so maybe your producers could share this. There's like 3 pieces, at least from Epicenter. There's probably a little bit more around the ballot questions. And I have to say, like in my group chats in New York City, and I'm a part of embarrassingly many of them, the ballot questions have actually been what we're hearing about most. And it's not like suddenly there's an interest in them. I think it's because people are confused by them. So exactly to Samipa's point, the links that I'm posting here basically break them down roughly. The first one is a protection of gender rights, and then 2 through 6 are overarching power for the Adams administration, if I had to distill it into kind of how we've been framing them. And then the links that I sent basically take you on each initiative and summarize them. So
people should go to Epicenter NYC, check out all their election coverage, but this can really help understand what's going on. The Adams administration is in trouble, but that isn't stopping them from trying to accumulate power. One of the things that we heard Mary put so eloquently, that when it's about power, people are lost, the poor are lost, and that becomes an issue. Kati Joshi is watching this. Mitra, I knew you started a new project, but today's the first day I've learned all about what you do. I just went to the website and signed up for all the newsletters. That's so cool. I'm excited to dig in. So everyone, please do this. This is what it takes to be a CEO of a media company. You're going retail, hand to hand, going to different places.
You really are. Yeah.
And the fact is that you are around a lot. People know what you're doing, but it's hard to pay attention when there's so much in the news and so many media products out there. So we're so grateful. You'll give me a 60-second heads up when you need to leave, because I know it's a very busy day.
I have about 5 more minutes, if that's okay. I will say that, Sree, the other thing on what you're describing in this fragmented media coverage is that both the left and the right often feel not captured in any media, right? So there's like it's not even that underground, but for example, something like Truth Social, or, signal channels that people might set up to communicate. We've had, and again, not to be scary, but I think we do need to be pragmatic. Like, there are white militias in this country, and how do they organize? And thankfully, according to our security experts, the FBI knows a lot more about them now than they did on January 5th, right? Of 2020. And so of 2021 rather. So I think just the ability to tap into some of those networks, or at least know that they exist, because so much of your coverage right now, you might think it's business as usual. You're following, let's say, CNN, where I used to work. That's what I'll be watching tonight. I'm joining you in that, but also with an awareness of that might not capture fully the media that everybody is consuming in the US and also just globally.
And that makes so much sense. And everyone, please check out the work of URL Media. We saw on the screen that about 4 million early votes have been cast in New York, and they're showing us the early votes being cast across the country. I saw a headline, Trump saying he's no regrets. He ran his best campaign. And there's been so much disinformation and misinformation, Mary. How do you, and then we'll ask Mitra the same question, how do you help voters understand that there are so many lies that are being told all the time?
Well, sometimes when people approach me with a certain lie that they've read, I just try to get very specific with them. When someone came to me and was talking about the reality of the Haitians are eating their pet story. And I said, the Wall Street Journal, which is a pretty conservative paper owned by Rupert Murdoch, sent a reporter to dig deep into that story and totally debunked it, so you have to look at a variety of outlets, of course. Even I turn on Fox and different news channels to see how they're leading and what kind of guests they have. So I would just say to look at a majority of ones. And then there are different websites like Mitra's, like ProPublica, like, one of my mentees, Wendy Thomas, MLK at 50, which does a lot of investigative work in the South. So, I just would say to kind of look at the variety, discuss it with friends and also folks you trust. And I do think local papers, I'm sorry that they are disappearing, because they have been such a great resource, and local TV stations, which more and more are being consumed by chains that are dictating the kinds of editorials and stories that they cover. So it's really difficult. So I'm really happy that Mitra's here getting new voices and new folks signing up, because that's the place you have to go to. And also different minority outlets as well that have the voices of minority folks there that you often don't see quoted, covered as sources. What do you think, Mitra?
Well, I think there's been a lot of rightful combat of misinformation. And if you look at like foundations and even companies, they're actually putting money behind this. So if you're an outlet like mine, you want a piece of that. On the other hand, sometimes it feels like we're not funding the good information, right? Mm. And so in our efforts to fund combating what's wrong, I know this because I spent years following user behavior online. The lie will always get more traffic than the fact check, right? I know this from CNN, which is the largest website on the planet. The lie, like Trump said something, right, will always get more traffic than he was wrong and here's the truth. And that's just kind of human nature and what works online. And so for outlets like mine now, while we are actively combating misinformation, there's a few trends to be aware of. One is called pre-bunking. How do we get in front of communities that might be ripe for disruption? So some of this we've seen, and there have been reports on this. I think ProPublica did some really good work around Russian misinformation targeting Latino communities. How do we get in front of that? The other piece, which I'm so privileged to spend this phase of my career on, is breeding trust in communities. And I think we don't talk about this enough, and it's something I feel kind of sheepish that it took me 30 years in media to understand. once I help somebody, right? So if somebody, for example, as happened 2 weeks ago at Epicenter, says, the government used to publish these guides on voting, I don't have a printout. And we say, oh, we could just print that out for you. And we give somebody a physical printout of information they need. Something happens in that action, which is they trust me. But beyond that, they turn to me again, right? They'll call me again and say, I just read that the COVID booster might not be effective and I should be careful, or that men are having this. I'm repeating misinformation, so to be clear that. And that trust is actually what media, I think, need to lean into, which is how are we in service of our communities so that they will call us and turn to us over and over and over again. Now, as we've seen over the last few weeks, you do one wrong move and people will unsubscribe. They don't trust you. They will be vocal about it. But I think if you hold that trust sacred and you keep trying to establish that relationship, now that's only possible if you're small like me and you have, as I mentioned, this kind of national boost through shared advertising and resources in the form of a URL media. Now that's the model that's worked for us. But I think in that equation of how you establish trust, there's a lot that, the CNNs of the world can learn from. Are we squarely in service to human beings, right? And how are we showing that every day?
And of course, we know that corporate media isn't in service necessarily of their audiences. They're in service to their shareholders, and that leads to other issues. I know Mitra has to go. There's so much happening all over the country. But before she goes, I want to tell folks that the way she's described how you think about media in a new way is fascinating. We've used the term service journalism for decades in the media, but she did something that was so unusual during the pandemic. She decided, she and her team, that not just to tell people where they can get their COVID vaccine or whether they should take it, they actually helped sign up people to get the vaccines into arms. And I said, there were some people who were questioning the ethics, the media ethics of, centuries of thinking about this stuff. And she had the perfect answer that keeping your readers alive is the ultimate service journalism, because you're keeping them alive. And this idea that everything has multiple sides that we have to discuss in excruciating detail. Well, let's put these vaccines in arms is what she did. I'm so proud of everything that they have pulled together, not just that episode and those issues, but so much more. Mitra, before you go, your final thoughts.
Oh, everybody, I guess lean into your communities for the days to come, no matter what happens. It will be historic. But, there's been a lot of, again, I mentioned I'm on a lot of group texts. We do have a story about how to get through your anxiety on epicenter-nyc.com. But, we find that turning into your neighbors is probably the best way to get through these moments. And the armchair toxicity probably isn't that productive. And so no matter what happens over the next few years, I really hope that they're not like the last 8 years of how we've been engaging. I hope that a new media emerges, a new electorate emerges. And I actually think institutions, no matter what happens, the wrong lesson from this would be that we can somehow stay status quo.
Thank you. Diana says, thanks, Mitra, for your service. I'm super impressed by everything you do. Jonathan says, Viva Mitra. So with that, we will let you get back to your very important work, helping people vote today, understand today, and make good decisions in their lives. Thank you very much, Mitra.
Remember, self-care, Mitra.
That's the word I was looking for. When Thank you, Mary. I have so much to learn from you. I'm so grateful to spend this time with you all. Take care, everyone.
That's Mitra Kalita. What a conversation. Kaveri says amen to that, Mitra. What we want to tell folks is that this is just part of our conversation that we're having around all things with the elections. And so we're going to put on screen our list of shows that are coming up. We're working very hard, Mary and I, today. We have this show right now. And then we also have shows at 9 p.m. and at 11 p.m. Eastern time. Those times translate into India time in the morning on Wednesday at 7:30 a.m. and then at 9:30 a.m. So make sure you tune in for those shows. The live show on the Indian Express channel is called America Decides, live from New York. And we're going to have our friend our friend Mary with us.
Okay.
And then we will also have with us Lee Meringhoff from the famous Marist poll, the national poll that so many news organizations rely on. So he'll be giving us real-time analysis by 11 p.m. You don't want to miss that show. So thank you everybody for being here. We have about another 25 minutes left and so much to discuss.
Yeah.
Here Rose says, good conversation. I voted early in Connecticut and we had a ballot question to continue to allow early voting or not. I was fortunate to vote yes for Senator Chris Murphy's re-election. The way these elections work, folks, is that every member of the House of Representatives is up for re-election every 2 years, which means they're so distracted while serving in office. And then the senators are for 6 years, but it's staggered, so you can't always predict who is running when. Dan Foreman says, another great Sree show with critical information to understand the fabric of what is happening, what is at stake, and all of us being of service to the community. Thank you, Mitra and Mary, for caring so much and communicating what people can do. That is so important. But Jayanti says, Mitra was a nice in the show. Congratulations. And Jayanti also pointed out that this is a year of elections. Something like 60% of the world has participated or will have participated in elections by the end of the year. And many countries are having the same issues we have, misinformation, disinformation, as we discussed.
Definitely.
And in another context, also nationalism. And now I want to go to the issue of religion. And you have pointed out that that is a major factor in this year's election. So over to you, Mary.
Well, when we have the poll person on, one thing that I'm sure they'll find is the group that has been the heaviest and the most loyal to Trump through thick and thin have been white evangelicals. And we talk a lot about Christian nationalism. And often when I go to these religious-based rallies, the talk is, we are a Christian country, which of course we're not. We have freedom of and from religion, but Trump has really leaned into this. One rally he had in Concord, North Carolina, was religious-based. He stood on stage with Franklin Graham, who said that God's hand is in this election. And particularly after the 2 assassination attempts, you have seen them and Trump leaning into this, that God spared Trump for a reason, that he's chosen in some way. And the fact that he has so many character issues and flaws and marriages and so on, it doesn't seem to matter because he is seen as a vessel. And sometimes God chooses flawed vessels. Of course, this is an exclusionary kind of worldview. And he has said recently that America has become anti-Christian and they can always get to him with a phone call now. You have even seen a lot of faith leaders, usually right-leaning faith leaders, laying hands on Trump when he was in the White House and even now praying over him. And it's always struck me as a person of faith, I believe, of course, I'm a flawed person too, that this isn't exactly what our founders and what religion is supposed to be about. Freedom, the separation of church and state protects the church as well as the state. And we've seen this lean into policy as well. I know in North Carolina and many other states, the Republican majority, they voted to give taxpayer money to pay for school vouchers. And what started out as programs to help poorer people if they wanted to send their children to private or religious schools is now expanded to actually include everyone. I know in North Carolina, no matter, even if you were already sending your child to a religious or a private school, then actually the state will pay. And their reasoning is that the money should follow the child. But the argument against it is it chokes off public schools in this country and in the state. Teachers' salaries haven't raised up that much. And a lot of school districts, particularly in poor areas, go wanting. But it's all wrapped up in this one view of what religion is. And as I've mentioned before, at these rallies, it's mostly about Christian nationalists attaining power. You hear very little about the least of these. I actually wrote a column about that in Roll Call, but Trump is really leaning into it. And one thing, if he loses, if you believe that God is on your side, then pretty much anything you do is fine, because whatever the means, you're working God's will. And if he loses, would that be God's will, or does that mean that you have to fight that because you are ultimately choosing the person that God means to be president? It's something we don't talk a lot about, but it's something I've really thought about, written about. And it also means a difference in how people view values. What are the values that you raise up? Are they the values your parents taught you? Kindness, humility, these kinds of things, or is it something else? And the folks who I've talked with who are Christians, who are for Trump, they won't hear anything else except the fact that he will protect Christian rights in a country they feel increasingly has gone in a secular direction. And this is all wrapped up in issues like transgender rights and all of these things. It's a very interesting phenomenon. And I bet you they will still be his most loyal voters this time. We can ask the pollster.
I agree on that. One of the things that I want to just talk about for a second is that we have an expert on this topic watching the show. We have White Christian, the author Kathy Joshi is watching. She's the author of White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America. And it's a book from 2020 that I recommend to everybody. I've interviewed her. She's a fantastic resource. The book is a fantastic resource as well. So please check out Professor Kathy Joshi's White Christian Privilege. One of the things I was doing was talking to Christians from India who live here. Only 2% of India is Christian, but much larger percentage of immigrants here are Christian, probably closer to 10, 15% of Indian immigrants from the state of Kerala, especially. And one of the things that I was telling them that you hear this thing of of Christianity is going to be lifted up by Donald Trump even more than it is. It doesn't include you. Just the way that Mexican Americans think that conservatives are going to be happy with them as they push conservatism or Catholicism, it doesn't include them. That's why it's important to understand it's white Christian privilege. It's not just Kerala Christian privilege or Black Christian privilege. Diana says her book is very informational and gives the URL there. So we really appreciate everyone participating here. Jayanti is watching from Gandhinagar in Gujarat, India, and I wanted to show our partnership with Scroll. We're live on their homepage, which is so cool, and you can see there. And we had the lead video yesterday in terms of viewership yesterday, Mary, and so we will again today and then tonight as well. Jayanti is watching at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and she's going to walk the farmer. She's a farmer of 67 but healthy, says Jayanti Patel. Thank you very much and we know farmers are so important, not just in India, but anywhere in the world. We have a question for you, Mary. Diana asked, what are you both doing for self-care today? Tell us your secrets. I heard the term nauseously optimistic, and I thought that's a very interesting term and probably describes how I'm feeling. But Mary, how about you?
Well, after I went to vote, I went to the gym. I'm not sure that was really great self-care because people were just talking about the election. But when I was getting ready for the show, I have to admit, I turned off the news and turned on some classical music, which really helped a lot. And the commentator on the station said, I know a lot of you are stressed about the election, so here's some Claude Debussy, which was pretty funny to me. But, it's difficult. My husband and I were saying we are both really on edge. But I would really follow what Mitra said about reaching out with friends and loved ones and community. And really look at a little bit of history. We have been through a lot as a country. We have had some very violent times when people despaired. Will it ever get better? And as my son, who's a historian, talks about, he always says, it's always cycles, progress, pushback, progress, pushback. And I guess you have to take the big picture. What are you doing, Sree?
I am busy doing this. I'm doing these shows as a way of working through everything that's going on. We are nervous, of course, but I think that this is a great thing that this country does. And one of the things that's going to happen is that about half the country is going to be very upset with the election results. And in some ways, you're going to hear people who just can't believe what has happened with the election results and will be so mad about it. But it's also important to recognize that we as a country do these elections, and then we are able to make sure that we are coming together and make progress. Otherwise, we will not get anywhere. There's a movie called Civil War that came out this year that talks about a future, near future, where Americans are actually picking up guns and fighting each other because of politics. And it's very scary. And I think a lot of it has to do with the rhetoric that has come from the extreme right, from Donald Trump himself. The way he speaks is not the way even the most uncouth former presidents like Richard Nixon and others would never have talked like he does in public. And therefore, we're seeing the impact of all of that here. We have about another 10, 15 minutes left. We have questions coming in. Folks, tell us your questions about the elections. Let's look at some of the ways to understand when the polls close. So Neil's going to make this on our screen. He's showing us that polls are going to close at 6 p.m., 7 p.m. These are the different states. All polls will close by certain times. So you see 9 p.m., 10 p.m. And then when we come back for our 11 p.m. show on Indian Express, I think we will know a lot more about where we are. And this could take several days. When Obama was elected the first time in 2008, by the 11 o'clock hour, he was declared victor. In 2012, it took till about 1 a.m. Eastern time in the U.S. And then in 2020, with Donald Trump in 2016, we knew the trends by about 10 p.m., 11 p.m., and he claimed victory rightly, it turns out, around 1 or 2 a.m. And in 2020, it took all the way till Saturday to know that Joe Biden had been elected, though Donald Trump claimed that the election was stolen from that night itself. And that's one of the things that's going to happen, is that he's going to declare victory. He has said, Mary, in a shocking, though nothing shocks me anymore with Donald Trump, he said, I shouldn't have left the White House in January 2021. That's the state of the world today. And he told us, from the time he got off that escalator in 2015, he has told us who he is, the way he attacked Latinos and others when he came down that escalator. And he told us, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose a single vote. In fact, he would gain voters. And that's the sad part of where we are with the world today. Your thoughts?
When it comes to declaring victory as well, in 2020, since he denied that he lost, and a lot of people, I think a majority of Republicans still feel the election was stolen. Since then, a lot of election deniers have become part of the election procedures and counting of the votes. And we've seen some shocking instances of certain counties in certain areas where the elections officials have refused to certify the votes and the ballots. In such cases, usually maybe the state attorney general sort of says, we have to do this and we'll prosecute you if you don't. But that's something else too. That some of them might say, in Georgia, remember, they tried to have that law that said if any county elections officials thinks there's something fishy, they don't have to certify. And the court said, no, you can't do that, particularly because it was so close to the election. But this is what now, it's not just misinformation. It's not just Donald Trump declaring victory. It's people out there who, despite the fact that he lost 60 whatever some cases that he contested the election, still believe that there were problems and that he won. So they can gum up the machinery. And the longer they take to certify, the more is a chance for misinformation to get out there. And of course, with so many people voting, there are going to be some glitches. Some place might run out of paper. Some connection might be temporarily broken. And every time this happens, it's going to be a new conspiracy theory that's out there. So I'm kind of fearful of that. And as Mitra was saying, the thought that some of it might turn into violence, sometimes against the election workers.
Yeah, and that's so tragic when that can happen at any time. I was voting today, and I noticed how many people who work the polls are women of color, who are coming out and doing their job. That's all that they're doing. Don says, I really needed this today. Thanks again for all the information, especially the reminder of self-care. Thank you. And Jayanti has a question, which is the oldest democracy in the world? As per my knowledge, Athens is the oldest. And I think we have to break it into ancient history and then modern history. And certainly when you look at Greeks, gave us democracy, but remember, their democracy was flawed, just as American democracy is flawed. They had slaves in Greece. So even when the United States got together, when the founding fathers, they enshrined slavery. They could have banned it, they could have outlawed it, but they chose to support slave owners, and many of them owned slaves themselves. So when you think about democracy, does it really mean a vote for everybody? And those slave-owning states have their powers enshrined in the Electoral College, in the number of senators they have. And therefore, we have this situation in the United States where I'm going to pull up that map again of the 270 to win, just to show folks that you are really looking at, you say, wow, there's so much red. But just in LA, there are more people in LA than most of the red places or many of the red states that you see. And therefore they will be able to decide who runs this country in this unfair way. Whenever anyone says, why can't you abolish the Electoral College? These small states, Montana, Wyoming, and others they're large states, but few small populations, have no reason to give up their power. Why would they do that? They would lose money, lose importance. They will never do that. And so we're held hostage by these other states. And so we're now looking at we just have a couple of minutes left. I want to just go through the electoral map and explain to everybody quickly what's happening. I don't think Montana is anything but Republican. So here we go. Look at the upper numbers, right? So at the very top, you see 230 and 215. This is the way it is before the swing states. So the swing states, you can see on the West Coast, you see Nevada, you see Arizona. And then you see on the Midwest, you see Wisconsin, Michigan, and then Pennsylvania on the East, North Carolina, where Mary is, and Georgia. So throughout the night, we will start filling in these. And if Kamala Harris holds on to Pennsylvania, if I make that blue, Michigan, and Wisconsin, she will have, she'll have 274. So that's one path for her to get it. But if she loses Michigan, as there is a good chance she might, if she loses Michigan, she's at 259. So she needs to get those votes somewhere else. One place is North Carolina. If that turns, she gets 275. Georgia is another option. If she doesn't get North Carolina, she gets 275 there as well. And then if Trump gets all of these states, let's see here, he's already at 262. And then he needs Nevada. Even Nevada is not enough, but he needs Arizona to hit that 273. So this is where it'll all end up tonight, and we will find out very soon after whether we will know tonight or not. What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't know. I can't. I told some people I have no idea. I do think one thing that I'm thinking of as I'm looking at all the comments coming in, I love that your show gets an international audience, because so often America feels we just look inward. It's only American issues. But what this election says will mean a lot, and a lot of different things to countries all over the world. So our audience is as international as your audience. They want to see what America is going to do because they feel it's crucial. And while all of them will have to deal with whomever the American people, whether it's Trump or Harris, I'm sure they all have their preferences, whether they're in Israel, Gaza, the EU, the countries that are bordering Russia, who might be pretty fearful of Putin. It's fascinating to me. So I think when you look at that bigger picture, that will be something that I'll be looking at as well.
Here is what I wrote in my newsletter. And I said, forward this to undecided, persuadable voters, if there are any. I also said that Elon Musk deserves to lose. And I wrote previous week, I wrote that it's so important to understand that women's issues, so-called women's issues, are actually everybody's issues. And you can subscribe to my newsletter at sreenet.substack.com, sreenet.substack.com, or connect with me on LinkedIn, where I publish my newsletter there as well. Mary, tell folks where they can find you and the great writing and conversations you hold.
Well, I write a column for Roll Call, so you can find me, my authors page at Roll Call, where you'll also find my CQ Roll Call Equal Time with Mary C. Curtis podcast. I have an authors page at Slate where I guest host their What Next podcast on occasion, and I tend to put everything I do on maryccurtis.com.
And there's some wonderful pictures of you with Jill Biden, with
Kamala Harris.
I like those pictures. Also, you with Senator Santorum. So you interview everybody and you talk to everybody. Before we go, let's just look at some of the headlines on the big networks. On the left is MSNBC. On the right is Fox. At the bottom is CNN. Trump, of course, there will be no violence, he says, even though he's been threatening violence every day. On Fox, more women are registered in the U.S. There are about 3 million more women in the U.S. than men. And in Pennsylvania, you're seeing down here, they're saying how key battleground states count votes. So that's something useful to know as well on this election day. So much going on, so much news being created, and we'll be paying close attention. We will be back in about 6 hours. In about 8 hours, when we will be talking about the elections, and the first polls will have closed. We'll know a lot more. This is a map that Diana Rohini is showing us. This is from NPR, and it shows the U.S. based on electoral votes, not on landmass. And so if you look at this, see how much more blue there is, see how much more mixed it is when you see this versus the other one. So that's very interesting. I know Neil also has somewhere the New York Times prediction needle, which caused PTSD to a lot of folks because it kept saying that Hillary Clinton's going to win, and then it just flipped back. So we'll be keeping an eye on that also for later today. And he'll bring that onto the site when we are back. So Mary, give us some words of wisdom. What should we be thinking about in these last few hours?
I don't know how wise, but I am going to be seeing the turnout for women, because the headline might be, and I'm not Nostradamus or anything, that women were the driving force in this election, and how big a role that the Dobbs decision might have played.
That's the anti-abortion.
Yes, the Roe v. Wade overturning it. And you see these on the ballots in, I believe, Florida and several other states, the abortion, their tight bans, their strict bans are coming up for voting. And we've seen even in red states like Kansas in the past, when they've had these bans on the ballot, the women have come out and tossed them. So I think the turnout among women and how they vote and on what issues might be one of the big stories of this election.
Thank you. That's Mary C. Curtis. I'm Sree Srinivasan. Before we go, we want to show you a couple of things. One is just to show you how the Indian community has gotten involved in these elections. What are some of the things that they're doing? So I'm going to pull up here on our screen a set of signs that was shown in Texas, and this is in let's pull that up here on stage. Here you can see that vote Republican, make the border secure again. Those are in two different South Indian languages, in Telugu and Tamil, And so you're seeing a Ted Cruz sign. And so that's an example of outreach by the Republicans. And we also want to show you a video of a friend of mine, Shobana, with David. She made a really cool video about voting. And I will play that audio in just a minute. But Mary, we'll let you say goodbye. Thank you very much. And we'll leave playing this audio for you from this particular song here. Just give me 1 second, Mary. Before you leave, oops, I think we lost Mary already. Can you just tell us one thing that, apart from the role of women, where in terms of the timing will you be paying attention to?
Do you have me back now? Oh, good. I hope you didn't lose me for too long.
No.
Well, also the turnout among folks of color. They won't, in some ways, they've been made scapegoats. If Kamala Harris loses, it'll because Black men didn't show up, or this or that didn't show up. But actually, they won't decide the election. The majority of folks in this country are still white. But I will be interested in seeing that, particularly since she had a very good turnout machine going on. How interested are people? That number you keep quoting of all the folks that didn't vote, are more people going to get up off that couch? Because that's really what we're fighting. It's not Democratic, Republican. Sometimes it's apathy. Will you get up off that couch? So I will be really interested in seeing the turnout.
All right. With that, we're going to say goodbye, everybody. We'll see you at 9 p.m. Eastern. Here's Vote. So I guess the audio is not coming through. I'm sorry. It's okay. You'll check this out. Shobana Ram. Just look up Shobana Dance, and you'll be able to see this. I'm sorry that we're not able to get you that audio. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.